But in fact, while we're on that, I think it'd be interesting for people to know that that particular guy, Cornelius, I was in a relationship with him, and we were having unprotected sex, because neither of us had ever had any sexually transmitted infections. When he came under pressure, I can't remember who it was from now, but one of his friends that really advised him and scared him into going to have an HIV test against my advice. So he went, and then I went with him back for the result, and lo and behold, it was positive. And he was absolutely broken. He was absolutely broken by that, just distraught. Now, what I already knew a lot by that time, and it didn't particularly faze me at the time, although what I will say is that when you're looking at something sort of almost academically, dispassionately from a distance, and you get an understanding about it, it's completely different from having it slammed right up in your face. And when all of a sudden you think, right, now I've really got to test myself, and you start having to re-examine closely everything you've previously looked at, you really do it with an intensity of focus. But it really became clear to me when I re-examined everything really closely. I thought, no, this is a huge cock-up. Nothing really withstands scrutiny from the orthodox perspective. And in the end, after 2 or 3 days when I'd been intensely re-examining everything, I realized that I had more faith in my ability to understand what was really going on than I had unquestioning faith in orthodox medicine. So it wasn't denial, it was faith in my ability to analyze effectively from closely looking at information from both sides of the debate. That's substantially different from being in denial. And so I told him, I said, look, I don't believe you've got anything infectious to give me. We'll carry on having unprotected sex just as we were before. And in that relationship, I was almost entirely the bottom, if you like, and he was the top. So, if you like, I was theoretically putting myself in the most
risky position
sexually that you could possibly have. So anyway, and I did check with my intuition specifically. I deliberately asked my unconscious mind, or just asked my intuition, is this the right thing to do? And I got a clear and resounding yes. So I felt confident about doing it. So I didn't think I was taking my life in my hands because I'd looked at the evidence. And for the rest of that relationship, we'd had sex about probably, not counting it, but calculating it from roughly how often we were doing it, about another 70 times. Now, after we broke up, after about 6 months, I had an HIV test, not because I believed in them, but to prove to him that I still hadn't caught anything. And on 2 occasions subsequently, I've had tests, again, not because I believe in them, but because there were women with whom I was considering having a child, and they insisted on the test first, so I really had no choice about it. But both of those were negative as well. So supposedly I was having the most dangerous sex it's possible to have with a guy diagnosed HIV positive, and I didn't catch anything. But of course now, looking back, we now realize that he was probably diagnosed positive because he had only just had his hepatitis B vaccination, and hepatitis B is one of the things that's documented in multiple places to potentially trigger false positives. And he was black as well, so we know that black people naturally have a higher level of antibodies and higher level antibody response to antigens anyway. So those 2 factors alone probably explained why he was diagnosed positive.
How interesting that you walked your talk.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad I did. I think it's fair to say what also happened to him. After we split up, he became absolutely so depressed, really, really, really depressed. And this is partly because of psychological factors from his childhood and so on. And he stopped eating. Now, he then ended up with pneumonia, and of course pneumonia is highly associated with dramatic weight loss, which is what he's had, and he had no fat on him to start off with even. So he ended up looking skeletal really because he just didn't have the will to eat. He wasn't trying to kill himself, he just lost the will to eat. So when he was fairly close to death just from starvation, really, I whipped him out of that hospital at his request and took him to my local hospital where I was now living, where their attitude was towards him was completely different. And also I said to him, well, I think when you get better from here, you better come and stay with me for a bit. And he made a dramatic recovery without any AIDS drugs whatsoever. So much so that within about 2 months, within about 3 months of me taking him from one hospital to my place and then to the next one, within about 3 months he went on his own to Amsterdam for the weekend, just to see a friend, and he didn't tell us he was going first because he knew we'd probably try to stop him. But they did a CD4 count at the time when he just entered the other hospital, so when he was just almost at death's door from the previous hospital, where he was very unhappy anyway, and where he'd been essentially starving himself, and the CD4 count was 9. So, of course, most doctors, that will be your imminent death, really, from AIDS. Or, you better start an antiretroviral straight away because we may not be able to save you otherwise. But, of course, he made his dramatic recovery without AIDS drugs, and that really reinforces the notion that CD4 counts are really a trailing edge indicator, not a leading edge indicator. So I've got personal experience that, in fact, they don't indicate imminent death at all, and they can be pretty misleading. And that's supported by orthodox medical research as well, which there was a meta-study which said that CD4 counts as a predictor of future health are about as useful as the toss of a coin. So I think it's important people don't get too hung up on those. And in fact, reality is it's best not to have CD4 counts or viral load tests because they are really misleading. Now, eventually what happened when he was staying with me for a while, I eventually wanted him to move on because I wanted to move on. We weren't partners anymore, and I wanted to move on with my life. And it's pretty difficult to start dating anybody else when your ex is still sleeping in the same bed. It just doesn't work. So I was really putting increasing pressure on him to move out, and he was desperately trying to stay with me. And essentially, the day I took him to stay with his sisters, he became so ill that we ended up taking him straight into hospital, and where he had a heart infection. And it turned out, and he was there for about 10 days and then died. Now it turned out during that occasion that his heart defect was worse than he'd led me to believe. He had 2 faulty heart valves, and he only ever told me he had 1. But also, it appeared that the start of when the heart infection would have started, from when they were projecting back, was about the same time that he'd secretly gone round to see a friend of mine to get advice on getting back into a relationship with me. Now, he hadn't told me about this, and neither was a friend allowed to. I mean, I think they knew it would have been emotional blackmail if he'd said these things, but basically he told my friend that he would rather die than be separated from me, which is a tragic situation for anyone to end up in. But that's, I think, really as a consequence of the fact that, he regarded me as having saved his life previously when he got the diagnosis, by not acting as if he was about to die, basically. So that was a really, really tragic situation. But of course, now that would be typically regarded as death from AIDS, especially if you didn't take the antiretrovirals. But the problem is when you look in detail at his whole complex life history, and that included having exorcisms as a child, by the way, arranged by his parents to stop him being gay, and a number of other factors as well.
They didn't work, did they?
They didn't work. No, of course they didn't work. But, you know, the amount of psychological distress he'd been under was just absolutely enormous. I mean, one day he cried on my shoulder and said, "I don't know if I'm going to heaven or hell." That was because of the religion.